Sure, he said, if that was his name. I thought you lent him the apartment, she said, surprised. I don't know anything about him, Mr. Royster said. He's one of Dottie's friends. Not my friends, Mrs. Royster said. No friend of mine. She had gone over to the table and was spreading her peanut butter on a piece of bread. She took a bite and said thickly, waving the bread and peanut butter at her husband, Not my friend. You picked him up at one of those damned meetings, Mr. Royster said. He moved a suitcase off a chair next to the radio and sat down, picking up a magazine from the floor next to him. I never said more than 10 words to him. You said it was okay to lend him the place, Mrs. Royster said before she took another bite. You never said a word against him, after all. I don't say anything about your friends, Mr. Royster said. If he'd been a friend of mine, you would have said plenty, believe me, Mrs. Royster said darkly. She took another bite and said, Believe me, he would have said plenty. That's what I want to hear. That's all I want to hear, Mr. Royster said over the top of the magazine. No more now. You see, Mrs. Royster pointed the bread and peanut butter at her husband. That's the way it is, day and night. There was silence except for the music bellowing out of the radio next to Mr. Royster. And then she said in a voice she hardly trusted to be heard over the radio noise, Has he gone, then? Who? Mrs. Royster demanded, looking up from the peanut butter jar. Mr. James Harris. Him? He must have left this morning before we got back, no sign of him anywhere. Gone? Everything was fine, though, perfectly fine. I told you, she said to Mr. Royster, I told you he'd take care of everything. Everything fine. I can always tell. You were lucky, Mr. Royster said. Not a thing out of place, Mrs. Royster said. She waved her bread and peanut butter inclusively. Everything just the way we left it, she said. Do you know where he is now? Not the slightest idea, Mrs. Royster said cheerfully. But like I said, he left everything fine. Why? She asked suddenly. You looking for him? It's very important. I'm sorry he's not here, Mrs. Royster said. She stepped forward politely when she saw her visitor turn toward the door. Maybe the super saw him, Mr. Royster said into the magazine. When the door was closed behind her, the hall was dark again, but the sound of the radio was deadened. She was halfway down the first flight of stairs when the door was opened and Mrs. Royster shouted down the stairwell, If I see him, I'll tell him you were looking for him. What can I do, she thought, out on the street. It was impossible to go home, not with Jamie somewhere between here and there. She stood on the sidewalk so long that a woman leaning out the window across the way turned and called to someone to come and see. Finally, on impulse, she went into the small delicatessen next door to the apartment house, on the side that led to her own apartment. There was a small man reading a newspaper leaning against the counter. When she came in, he looked up and came down inside the counter to meet her. Over the glass case of cold meats and cheese, she said timidly, I'm trying to get in touch with a man who lived in the apartment house next door, and I just wondered if you knew him. Why didn't you ask the people there? The man said, his eyes narrow, inspecting her. It's because I'm not buying anything, she thought, and she said, I'm sorry I asked them, but they don't know anything about him. They think he left this morning. I don't know what you want me to do, he said, moving a little back toward his newspaper. I'm not here to keep track of guys going in and out next door. She said quickly, I thought you might have noticed, that's all. He would have been coming past here a little before 10 o'clock. He was rather tall, and he usually wore a blue suit. Now how many men in blue suits go past here every day, lady? The man demanded. You think I got nothing to do but... I'm sorry, she said. She heard him say, for God's sake, as she went out the door. As she walked toward the corner, she thought, he must have come this way. It's the way he'd go to get to my house. It's the only way for him to walk. She tried to think of Jamie. Where would he have crossed the street? What sort of person was he actually? Would he cross in front of his own apartment house at random in the middle of the block at the corner? On the corner was a newsstand. They might have seen him there. She hurried on and waited while a man bought a paper and a woman asked directions. When the newsstand man looked at her, she said, Can you possibly tell me if a rather tall young man in a blue suit went past here this morning around 10 o'clock? When the man only looked at her, his eyes wide and his mouth a little open, she thought, He thinks it's a joke or a trick, and she said urgently, "It's very important. Please believe me, I'm not teasing you." "Look, lady," the man began, and she said eagerly, "He's a writer. He might have bought magazines here." "What do you want him for?" the man asked. He looked at her smiling, and she realized that there was another man waiting in back of her, and the news dealer's smile included him. "Never mind," she said, but the news dealer said, "Listen, maybe he did come by here." His smile was knowing, and his eyes shifted over his shoulder to the man in back of her. She was suddenly horribly aware of her over-young print dress, and pulled her coat around her quickly. The news dealer said with vast thoughtfulness, "Now, I don't know for sure, mind you, but there might have been someone like your gentleman friend coming by this morning. About 10. About 10. The news dealer agreed. "Tall fellow, blue suit. I wouldn't be at all surprised." "Which way did he go?" she said eagerly. "Uptown?" "Uptown," the news dealer said, nodding. "He went uptown. That's just exactly it. What can I do for you, sir?" She stepped back, holding her coat around her. The man who had been standing behind her looked at her over his shoulder, and then he and the news dealer looked at one another. She wondered for a minute whether or not to tip the news dealer, but when both men began to laugh, she moved hurriedly on across the street. Uptown, she thought. That's right. And she started up the avenue, thinking, he wouldn't have to cross the avenue, just go up 6 blocks and turn down my street. So long as he started uptown, about a block farther, she passed a florist's shop. There was a wedding display in the window, and she thought, this is my wedding day after all. He might have gotten flowers to bring me, and she went inside. The florist came out of the back of the shop, smiling and sleek, and she said before he could speak, so that he wouldn't have a chance to think she was buying anything, "It's terribly important that I get in touch with a gentleman who may have stopped in here to buy flowers this morning. Terribly important." She stopped for breath, and the florist said, "Yes, what sort of flowers were they?" "I don't know," she said, surprised. She stopped and said, "He was a rather tall young man in a blue suit. It was about 10 o'clock. "I see," the florist said. "Well, really, I'm afraid." "But it's so important," she said. "He may have been in a hurry," she added helpfully. "Well," the florist said. He smiled genially, showing all his small teeth. "For a lady," he said. He went to a stand and opened a large book. "Where were they to be sent?" he asked. "Why," she said, "I don't think he'd have sent them. You see, he was coming, that is, he'd bring them." "Madam," the florist said. He was offended. His smile became deprecatory, and he went on, "Really, you must realize that unless I have something to go on—" "Please try to remember," she begged. "He was tall and had a blue suit, and it was about 10 this morning." The florist closed his eyes, one finger to his mouth, and thought deeply. Then he shook his head. "I simply can't," he said. "Thank you," she said despondently, and started for the door when the florist said in a shrill, excited voice, "Wait! Wait just a moment, madam!" She turned to the florist, thinking again, said finally, "Chrysanthemums?" He looked at her inquiringly. "Oh, no," she said. Her voice shook a little, and she waited for a minute before she went on. "Not for an occasion like this, I'm sure." The florist tightened his lips and looked away coldly. Well, of course, I don't know the occasion," he said, "but I'm almost certain that the gentleman you were inquiring for came this morning and purchased 1 dozen chrysanthemums, no delivery." "You're sure?" she asked. "Positive," said the florist emphatically. "That was absolutely the man." He smiled brilliantly, and she smiled back and said, "Well, thank you very much." He escorted her to the door. "Nice corsage," he said as they went through the shop. "Red roses, gardenias." "It's very kind of you to help me," she said at the door. "Ladies always look their best in flowers," he said, bending his head toward her. "Orchids, perhaps?" "No, thank you," she said, and he said, "I hope you find your young man," and gave it a nasty sound. Going up the street, she thought, everyone thinks it's so funny, and she pulled her coat tighter around her so that only the ruffle around the bottom of the print dress was showing. There was a policeman on the corner, and she thought, why don't I go to the police? You go to the police for a missing person, and then thought, what a fool I'd look like. She had a quick picture of herself standing in a police station saying, Yes, we were going to be married today, but he didn't come. And the policemen, 3 or 4 of them, standing around listening, looking at her, at the print dress, at her too bright makeup, smiling at one another. She couldn't tell them any more than that, could not say, "Yes, it looks silly, doesn't it? But me all dressed up trying to find the young man who promised to marry me. But what about all of it you don't know? I have more than this, more than you can see. Talent, perhaps, and humor of a sort, and I'm a lady, and I have pride, and affection, and delicacy, and a certain view of life that might make a man satisfied, and productive, and happy. There's more than you think when you look at me." The police were obviously impossible, leaving out Jamie, and what he might think when he heard she'd set the police after him. "No, no," she said aloud, hurrying. Her steps and someone passing stopped and looked after her. On the coming corner, she was 3 blocks from her own street, was a shoeshine stand. An old man was sitting almost asleep in one of the chairs. She stopped in front of him and waited, and after a minute he opened his eyes and smiled. "Look," she said, the words coming before she thought of them. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for a young man who came up this way about 10 this morning. Did you see him?" And she began her desperation. And she began her description. "Tall, blue suit, carrying a bunch of flowers." The old man began to nod before she was finished. "I saw him," he said. "Friend of yours?" "Yes," she said, and smiled back involuntarily. The old man blinked his eyes and said, "I remember. I thought, you're going to see your girl, young fella. They all go to see their girls," he said, and shook his head tolerantly. "Which way did he go? Straight up on the avenue?" "That's right," the old man said. "Got a shine, had his flowers, all dressed up in an awful hurry. You got a girl, I thought." "Thank you," she said, fumbling in her pocket for a loose change. "She sure must have been glad to see him the way he looked," the old man said. "Thank you," she said again, and brought her hand empty from her pocket. For the first time, she was really sure he would be waiting for her, and she hurried up the 3 blocks, the skirt of the print dress swinging under her coat, and turned into her own block. From the corner, she could not see her own windows, could not see Jamie looking out, waiting for her, and going down the block, she was almost running to get to him. Her key trembled in her fingers at the downstairs door, and as she glanced into the drugstore, she thought of her panic, drinking coffee there this morning, and almost laughed. At her own door, she could wait no longer, but began to stir. "Jamie, I'm here. I was so worried," even before the door was open. Her own apartment was waiting for her, silent, barren, afternoon shadows lengthening from the window. For a minute, she saw only the empty coffee cup, thought, He has been here waiting," before she recognized it as her own, left from that morning. She looked all over the room, into the closet, into the bathroom. "I never saw him," the clerk in the drugstore said. "I know, because I would have noticed the flowers. No one like that's been in." The old man at the shoeshine stand woke again to see her standing in front of him. "Hello again," he said, and smiled. "Are you sure?" she demanded. "Did he go on up the avenue?" "I watched him," the old man said, dignified against her tone. "I thought, there's a young man's got a girl, and I watched him right into the house." "What house?" she said remotely. "Right there," the old man said. He leaned forward to point. "The next block, with his flowers and his shine, going to see his girl, right into her house." "Which one?" she said. "About the middle of the block," the old man said. He looked at her with suspicion and said, "What are you trying to do anyway?" She almost ran without stopping to say, "Thank you." Up to the next block, she walked quickly, searching the houses from the outside to see if Jamie looked from a window, listening to hear his laughter somewhere inside. A woman was sitting in front of one of the houses, pushing a baby carriage monotonously back and forth the length of her arm. The baby inside slept, moving back and forth.